Hi, Jo here. So the first video log. This one is going to be about planting, so napping or refusing to move, standing still. So this was the one that was mentioned on the meetup by a few of you, as you are struggling to handle this. And what to do about it, how to change things for your horse and that kind of stuff. So instead of me writing a massive essay on one of the meetups, I thought I'd start this vlog, which will hopefully build to a few different topics over time. So, planting, napping, a big problem. The reasons for that, and I think that's a good place to start, looking really at things, is the reasons, because we have to look at the motivations for behaviour in order to try and understand it, and then we can look at changing things, but if we first of all need to understand the motivations behind it. So if we look at how most horses are motivated to move forward, then even though it might seem like we're actually just walking next to them and we're not applying aversives, the way that they learnt that behaviour initially would have been to avoid the escalation of any pressure on their head. So, or even sort of any escalation of any energy from the handler kind of moving forward, and it was then released to reinforce the behaviour. So that's negative reinforcement. So they will have expected and experienced an escalation in aversive stimuli in order to make that behaviour happen at the very first few times it did happen. And then soon enough they start to learn to avoid that escalation of the aversive. So they don't experience the pull on the lead rope or the kind of energy or the flapping of energy to get them to move anymore, because they're under threat of that, so they're avoiding that happening and that occurring in the environment, which is also negative reinforcement. So even though we're just walking along on a nice loose lead rope, they are still behaving under the threat of the escalation of that aversive. Now, if they stop moving, we then have to, if we're using negative reinforcement, we have to make that behaviour happen in order that we can then release the aversive again. So there's always that threat of escalation. When we stop using aversives and when we come to positive reinforcement training, we become much more aware of the aversives that we're using, and so we don't want to use those aversives anymore. We want to train things so that we have them motivated to move towards gaining something that is really pleasurable to them, rather than avoiding something which is aversive. So we almost get gentler. We become much more aware of escalating things to a point of forcing and coercing behaviour to happen. And so we stop escalating those aversives to make that behaviour happen. And so actually the horse very quickly realises that they don't have to move. The motivation isn't there anymore. They're not worried about experiencing that aversive because it doesn't come. We don't do it. We don't pull on them or put any pressure on them anymore. And so of course the standing still then often is inadvertently very strongly negatively reinforced. So when we stop escalating things, they very quickly habituate to lower strength aversives. So those threats sort of no longer are threats anymore. Habituation is covered in the How Horses Learn, Feel and Communicate course, so if you haven't done that yet, it will all become clear once you do. But basically habituation is a gradual reduction of the response to a stimulus over time. So effectively that threat signal that we were using, kind of chivvying them along a little bit, they habituate to it. They just become desensitized to it, so it no longer achieves the behaviour that it did previously. So basically, when we've removed that escalation and that threat, and they know that we've removed that threat, and they've been negatively reinforced for standing still instead of moving forward, there's a massive lack of motivation there on their part. And so that usually contributes fairly massively, I would say, to why we see such a lot of planting and such a lot of refusing to move forwards in our horses when we start the journey with positive reinforcement. So what can we do about this? I think the first thing to remember is that when we first start this journey into positive reinforcement, we are at the very beginning of starting to train and learn how to train this way. And so we are experimenting and beginning to train those basic behaviours that we need for day-to-day stuff, but we haven't quite finished training them yet. And so they're not on cue, and we haven't got a means or a way of being able to ask our horses to do all those basic behaviours of leading, stopping, turning, standing still, picking up feet, all those basic sort of handling behaviours. We haven't got a means of being able to motivate them to do those, or to ask them to do them and then motivate them to do them using positive reinforcement yet. And so, but what we do know is that we don't want to motivate them using aversives anymore. And so we're kind of stuck in this no man's land where what do we do about it? Until such time as we've actually trained those behaviours using positive reinforcement and have cues for them and are able to actually ask our horses to do them reliably. So before that point, we do need to kind of accept that we are going to have to train those separately. And what I'm going to do first of all here is just quickly focus on some of the things that we can do or that we can use within the training sessions to actually help transfer these things over into everyday stuff when we want to be able to lead them somewhere. Most of all, we use targeting, really, but targeting can come in different forms. So there's the basic handling tutorial bundle, which shows you how to use a handheld target to create these behaviours and then transfer the cues. But there's also other things, such as Rebecca said on the group, which was great, is frisbee throwing. Or target throwing, any type of target really. It could be a small football cone, it could be a frisbee, it could be even a dog toy. Excuse me. Whatever your horse enjoys touching, you teach him the behaviour of touching his nose to that first of all, and then you start to gradually throw it maybe a foot away from you and he heads towards it and touches it with his nose. You click and treat, bridge and reinforce. And you gradually stretch out the distance that you start throwing it. And of course that again engages the horse in a fun behaviour, it's a playful behaviour, especially if you start teaching them to fetch as well, so they actually pick it up and give it to you after you've thrown it. They're all ways of creating behaviours that involve moving forwards, so effectively leading behaviours, but in a fun and way which is motivated obviously very much by the appetites of gaining both the fun toy as well as the treats or the scratches that are given after the horse has performed that behaviour. There are also stationary targets which are brilliant, and I use a lot of these actually for all sorts of different things. But stationary targets are basically targets which are set up and they don't move. So you put them in position and the horse kind of moves around, you and the horse move around these stationary targets. They can be large cones and you can stick your handheld target into the top of one, or indeed you don't even need the handheld targets, you could just use the cone itself. But again, these are things which need to be trained initially somewhere calm, relaxed and enclosed at liberty, where the horse learns how to touch their noses to these objects before we start using them in complex environments where we want them to actually go somewhere. But the stationary targets are really useful. Another one that comes under those is mat training. Again, it's a stationary target, but it's a target for feet rather than noses. So again, it's a bit more complex. I tend not to use these so much anymore. I used to use them a lot, but I tend to just use the stationary targets now. But the mats work in a similar way. If you have taught your horse how to stand on a mat, then you can have a few mats in a row, for instance, and you can work your way backwards and forwards through these mats. And again, they're kind of motivational pulls, if you like, where the horse is wanting to move towards these objects rather than, as with the negative reinforcement, where they're kind of trying to move away from the thing to avoid these aversives. The targets, they're moving towards them, but producing the same behaviours. There is another area which I will cover very briefly that can be really helpful, and that is what I call a safe signal. Now, this isn't something that will help instantly. It's a bit like the targeting. You have to train these things to begin with to then be able to use them later down the line. But the safe signal is a little less obvious in terms of actually training it. It's not a behaviour as such that you're going to train your horse. It's a stimulus which you will sit in the environment every single time that you have a positive reinforcement training session. So it could be a cone, a specific cone. It could be a jumper that you sit to the side, or a scarf, or anything, just something very obviously different that is only ever produced and set aside to the side within the environment that you're working with, but clearly obviously to the horse. And it's there in every single positive reinforcement training session that you ever do. Now, over time, the horse will start to become aware of its presence. We're not teaching the horse to do anything with that object. It's literally just there, it's benign, but it will become associated with the pleasurable feelings and enjoyable, appetitive, emotional state that the horse is in during those training sessions. And so by default, it will also start to become a reliable predictor signal, if you like, that those emotions are going to be felt for the horse. And effectively that means that they have freedom to choose within those situations, within those sessions, and there's no coercion, there's no aversives in those situations. It's just purely a safe environment for them to try, for them to offer behaviour without needing to worry about corrections or any punishment. And so by default then, or the flip side of that, of course, is that the removal of that stimulus, or the fact that the stimulus isn't in the environment in some situations, means that in those situations the animal doesn't have a choice. And so it can start to be a nice label, if you like, or a nice environmental sort of signal indicator that just helps them to clarify when they have a choice and when they won't be experiencing punishment and aversives, and when they will have a choice. And whichever, I can't remember which way around I just said that, but the situation when the signal is there is that they have a choice, and the situation when the signal isn't there is that they don't have a choice, and aversives may well be used. So I think that's quite a nice thing, but it's not something that will help you overnight, but it's something to think about incorporating maybe, just to help set them up for their expectations, really. I want to just highlight about the destination as well, because obviously consequences play a big part in training, and all organisms quickly learn that whatever leads to a consequence, or an environmental situation that has lots of consequences, they will either want that to happen again, or they're not going to want that to happen again. So there's either an expectation of motivation of wanting something to happen again, or avoiding it. And if we make the destination that we're going to a really fun and enjoyable place to be, then they're going to want to go to that destination the next time, because they had a really great time there, and it was great fun, and they had lots of food and, you know, fun and play and whatever it might be. So that destination, those associations tend to kind of be remembered, if you like, and the perceptions of that destination location will be remembered for next time. Whereas if they were coming to that destination and they were going to be tacked up, and then they were going off for a traditional dressage lesson, for instance, which involved bits and lots of aversives, then perhaps they're not going to be so overjoyed about heading back to that same destination next time. So what can you do? How can you change their perceptions about the environments in order to be able to change how they feel about going there? You know, could you take them up to that yard instead of riding every time? Take them up there and have more of the outcomes where they just have a really enjoyable time eating on a haylage net or something before going back to the field. That's going to start to change how they feel about going to the yard, if they were previously only ever taken there to be ridden traditionally. It's just things to think about. The balance and the weight of reinforcement is also going to play a big part. How they feel about things, and next time, their perception next time. So if all the fun training and all the fun stuff happens outside of the field, in the yard, then every time you arrive, they're going to be waiting at the gate and desperately kind of wanting that to happen and wanting to go to the yard. Whereas if you know, if actually the field is a fun place to be as well, then they're going to want to go to the field. And so if one is more out of balance than the other, you're going to end up with horses who will gladly and willingly go one way, but not so willingly go the other way. And so it's just a question of looking at why that is, and starting to change the balance of the motivations and the balance of reinforcement. And again, just a little point here: if they are in a very barren field and they're turned out alone and it's a bit of a boring place, then they're not going to be that keen to go back out after they've spent some time doing lovely positive reinforcement training with us. So look at how maybe you can change things in their management so that their lives are a little bit more enriched when we're not around, trying to, you know, enable them some more interesting things to do in their field, to keep them busy and enlightened and sort of enriched when we're not around. So that's kind of covering what to do in the long term, in terms of kind of, well, even in the medium term really, you can teach the targeting and start to use that kind of stuff. But you will want to be doing that in specific training sessions. You're not going to be wanting to do that necessarily when you have the farrier coming in 10 minutes time. So that is one stream of things. You do need to start working on these kind of things and put the effort and the impetus in on those training sessions, because they are what is going to change how the horse feels about doing these things in the long run. But in the meantime, whilst you're still working on all of that, then there are certain things that you can do to help when the farrier is coming and you haven't been able to completely finish all that training. This is actually where I tend to encourage people to use a different head collar. So to have two separate head collars, one that is almost a safe head collar, and the other one which is your normal one, which you use day to day for whatever it is you need to do. Your safe head collar needs to really be completely and utterly different, so a very different bright colour, something so that it's very obviously visually different. And that head collar is going to be only ever brought out when the horse has the choice in the training. So if they don't want to interact, if they don't want to perform the behaviour such as following the target or doing whatever, then that's absolutely their choice. They don't have to do that in that session. This head collar is going to be almost a safe signal, if you like. It's not going to be the safe signal, but it's going to be another one like that, where it clearly says to the horse that you are empowered right now, and I'm not going to make you do anything. I'm not going to put pressure on you. I'm not going to punish you. I'm not going to correct you, and I'm not going to apply any pressure to you. So sometimes we usually start, or in fact most times we usually start with that head collar just being in the environment, not on the horse, but just in the environment whilst we're training with positive reinforcement, and then gradually introduce it to them and work up to having them wearing it whilst we're training. But we are certainly not going to apply any physical contact or any physical pressure via that head collar whilst it's on. And that head collar is not going to be used at any other time at all, only when we are in those training sessions. Because that is going to be the one eventually that you will use day to day, but not until you have all those behaviours taught really reliably, and you know that it doesn't matter that the farrier is coming in 10 minutes. You can use your walk-on cue, your verbal walk-on cue, and you can happily have your horse just stroll along next to you all the way up to the yard. And so only at that point does that head collar actually start to come into play for day-to-day stuff. In the meantime, what you're going to use is your old head collar, the one that has all those associations attached to it and that has been used previously with negative reinforcement training. So all your leading behaviours, and that head collar is going to go on those days where you don't have half an hour to be able to stand and wait for your horse to decide that he's going to choose to do something at 5 o'clock in the morning because you need to go to work. That is the one that you're going to be using, that head collar. You put it on and you're going to use mild aversives to prompt that behaviour to happen, that forward movement behaviour to happen. So I'm not suggesting that you escalate to a point that is awful to your horse at all. I'm not suggesting that you you get really tough. I'm just saying that in that situation, because you have no other behaviours taught yet, we have no other option but to use the language that your horse understands to get the job done, basically, until such time as we can retrain them. But it's important that we do note that this is only a transitionary period. It's not something that we are going to stay with for the rest of time, because you're training all these behaviours and you're going to be able to prompt them in a very different way soon. You can shape behaviour with aversives, so with mild aversives. So what I'm suggesting here in that head collar is that you apply a little bit of forward pressure, you think forward in your own body, you maybe add a little energy in your own body, and the moment your horse considers even remotely leaning forward, you're going to release that pressure and say, well done, by giving him a scratch. And then you're going to apply a little bit more, but you're going to keep applying that pressure until you get you're not necessarily going to escalate it to a point that is awful, but you're just going to keep that pressure on until such time as they give you just a tiny little bit, and then release. And shape it gradually onwards from there. And really that's how I tend to suggest that we all start things. Because the fun is very much in training all of these behaviours and getting them on cue, and having horses who are willingly offering things to us or for us. But there is this transitionary period, and I also do think actually as well that I just wanted to mention this because I think when horses come to positive reinforcement training from aversive based training, when they cross over, they tend to become a little cynical almost, and it's almost like they need to test us just to check, and sort of say, really, are you really not going to make me? And there's an element of I don't know what the word for it is really. It's just, I know a number of my clients have said this to me, and we've seen it time and time again, where the horses tend to become almost kind of bullish really for a while, and quite stubborn. And I know that's humanly anthropomorphizing things, but you know, I do think that there is an element of them that needs to test this, to just check and say, really, do I really have a choice? Or are you actually just joking in some sessions and not in others? You know, you're kind of pulling my leg. And so I think it's an important time for the horses that we give them that space to be able to say no, and not push them through. But we need to do that in structured sessions where we're not feeling under pressure ourselves, such as when it's 5 o'clock in the morning and we've got to get to work and we haven't got time to be, you know, understanding of their mental state right then. And so by doing it this way, where we have very separate sessions, we have very separate equipment, and we absolutely work really, really hard in those sessions where they are wanting to plant, and they will plant in those sessions when we give them that choice. That's good, because it's letting them know and letting them explore that actually they do really genuinely have a choice. We're not going to make them do it, and once that kind of really embeds itself into the horse, we start to see a big change. But that can, in their motivations and in their kind of like, oh right, well actually then, if you're not going to push me to do it, well I think I might be able to do it on my own. But that takes time, and each horse is very different obviously, and so we need to give them the space to be able to do that in those separate sessions when we have got time, when we're not in a rush, and within the framework of actually removing all the aversives from it and doing it with targeting and making it all very fun. But then have a way of actually saying, well, today, right now, no, I need to go to work. You have to come with me right now, you know. So that's how I tend to handle things. So great. Thanks for listening. See ya.